Imagine brutally suffocating your own newborn baby with your bare hands, simply to frame a rival and steal an empire. Do you think that's the act of a monster? No, that was merely the opening move of the most terrifying woman in Chinese history. Do not look away, because the true story you are about to hear will haunt your nightmares forever. The imperial palace was a sprawling, golden cage where innocence went to die, and 14-year-old Wu Zetian arrived with a heart already completely stripped of any naive illusions. She was merely a fifth-rank concubine, a seemingly disposable plaything in Emperor Taizong's incredibly vast collection of women, but her mind was already a complex, predatory labyrinth. The stifling air in the inner court was incredibly thick with the invisible, copper stench of paranoia, heavily fueled by a chilling astrological prophecy. A mysterious female ruler bearing the surname Wu would violently annihilate the Li dynasty. Blood flowed continuously like endless rivers as Taizong ruthlessly and systematically purged his most loyal generals, yet the true, catastrophic threat lay quietly right in his own bedchamber, observing the gruesome carnage with a deeply unsettling, icy fascination. Wu Zetian recognized extraordinarily early in her terrifying journey that human compassion was a fatal, pathetic weakness and that sheer, unadulterated fear was the absolute ultimate instrument of permanent control. While the other terrified girls exhausted themselves daily with elaborate silken dances and tearful, desperate poetry, fiercely vying for a fleeting, meaningless glance from the aging emperor, she deliberately opted for a massive psychological shock. The absolute defining moment of her early reign of psychological terror arrived when Taizong proudly presented his notoriously untamable horse, the magnificent but lethal lion stallion. As the bravest and most decorated generals of the empire faltered and stepped back in fear, the teenage girl confidently stepped forward with a chillingly calculated, sociopathic proposition. "I can tame this beast, she declared, her steady voice completely devoid of any recognizable human emotion, but I absolutely need 3 specific things, a heavy iron whip, a massive iron mace, and a sharp dagger. First, I will mercilessly whip its flesh until it bleeds profusely. If it stubbornly disobeys my command, I will brutally smash its skull with the iron mace. If it still actively resists my ultimate authority, I will simply slit its throat and watch it bleed out, The entire imperial court completely froze in collective horror. Taizong looked down and saw not a delicate, submissive flower, but a terrifying mirror flawlessly reflecting his own deeply hidden, monstrous ruthlessness. He was visibly unnerved, profoundly and permanently disturbed by the dark, bottomless abyss he recognized in her cold eyes. This extraordinary psychological masterstroke did not miraculously win his heart, but it successfully etched her unforgettable silhouette into his worst nightmares. She profoundly understood that being deeply feared was infinitely far superior to being genuinely loved. Human love was notoriously fickle and easily manipulated, but genuine, bone-deep terror was practically permanent. Cast aside and deliberately marginalized by a highly wary, deeply suspicious emperor, she brilliantly weaponized her own forced obscurity. In the dark, shadowy periphery of the sprawling harem, she methodically began cultivating a vast, clandestine network of completely disenfranchised eunuchs and deeply disgraced maids, slowly building the terrifyingly invisible eyes and ears of the palace. She meticulously documented every single rival's hidden vulnerability, every deeply secret liaison, systematically compiling a massive, invisible ledger of catastrophic blackmail. When she finally noticed the vulnerable crown prince, Gaozong, a notoriously weak, overly emotional boy actively suffocating in his legendary father's massive shadow, she recognized that she had found her absolutely perfect vessel for total domination. She didn't just physically seduce him, she actively and maliciously mentally infiltrated him, meticulously planting the dark seeds of a highly obsessive, profoundly toxic emotional dependency. The incredibly grand Game of Thrones had officially begun, and she was entirely prepared to deliberately pave her bloody path to absolute, unquestioned supremacy with a horrifying, towering mountain of fresh corpses. The death of Emperor Taizong abruptly plunged the entire palace into a chaotic, hysterical frenzy of entirely hollow, performative mourning, but for Wu Zetian, it clearly signaled the agonizing, highly calculated commencement of her grand, deeply insidious design for total absolute power. Stripped entirely of her incredibly opulent, colorful silks and brutally forced to immediately don the incredibly coarse, uncomfortable robes of a lowly Buddhist nun, she was quickly banished to the incredibly desolate, profoundly depressing Ganya temple. For a brilliant woman of her genuinely terrifying, bottomless ambition, the forced physical shaving of her head was absolutely not an act of genuine spiritual submission, but rather a profoundly devastating psychological brutalization specifically intended to completely erase her identity and deliberately bury her alive in a suffocating tomb of heavy incense and endlessly echoing, meaningless chants. The isolated temple was essentially a suffocating, terrifying purgatory completely filled with the deeply hollow-eyed, broken ghosts of completely discarded imperial concubines, deeply traumatized women who had already entirely surrendered their fragile minds to the suffocating madness of permanent obscurity. But Zetian fiercely and categorically refused to simply rot away in the dark shadows of history. She brilliantly transformed her terrifying isolation into a massively powerful psychological crucible, meticulously forging her deeply burning resentment into a massive weapon of unyielding, cold-blooded, psychopathic resolve. She absolutely knew that the newly crowned emperor, Gaozong, was continuously and heavily haunted by the highly forbidden, deeply intoxicating memory of their incredibly clandestine, highly transgressive sexual encounters. His notoriously weak, highly malleable will could be incredibly easily manipulated by the extremely potent, highly addictive drug of her absolute psychological dominance. She meticulously orchestrated her own visible suffering perfectly, incredibly precisely calculating the timing of every single tear and every agonizing sigh specifically for the exact moment Gaozong would inevitably arrive at the temple to publicly offer incense to his late father. When he finally stood awkwardly before her in the dim light, the heavy air instantly crackled with a deeply transgressive, intensely incestuous tension that defied all imperial norms. She expertly played the absolute ultimate psychological game, brilliantly displaying a completely fabricated facade of incredibly agonizing, heartbreaking vulnerability while simultaneously maintaining a terrifying, unbreakable iron grip on his deeply ingrained emotional fragility. She actively wept, but absolutely not with the pathetic, genuine desperation of a truly broken woman, but rather with the chillingly calculated, mathematical precision of an apex predator deliberately sinking its razor-sharp teeth deeply into a surprisingly soft, actively bleeding neck. The sheer, intoxicatingly forbidden nature of their intense reunion, a ruling son desperately coveting his late father's own former concubine deep within the highly sacred, supposedly pure confines of a Buddhist temple, instantly ignited a deeply sick, highly obsessive, and uncontrollable passion deeply within Gaozong's unstable mind. He was completely paralyzed by a deeply toxic, overwhelming mix of crushing guilt, burning lust, and an absolutely irresistible, masochistic yearning to be completely and utterly dominated by her undeniable psychological supremacy. She incredibly skillfully and relentlessly inflamed all his deepest insecurities, softly whispering deeply venomous, manipulative sweet nothings that deliberately isolated him entirely from his most trusted advisors and permanently bound his highly fractured, deeply dependent psyche inextricably to hers. Zetian did absolutely not merely desperately beg for a simple return to the opulent palace, she meticulously engineered a highly complex psychological situation where Gaozong actively believed that he was gallantly rescuing her from eternal suffering, when in dark reality, she was methodically, relentlessly dragging him deeply into a highly terrifying, inescapable web of total psychological servitude. She ultimately returned to the imperial harem absolutely not as a submissive subordinate, but rather as a highly silent, completely unstoppable plague, a genuinely lethal, creeping infection totally ready to systematically and ruthlessly eradicate any single soul foolish enough to stand between her and the absolute ultimate zenith of unmitigated imperial power. The inner imperial palace was essentially a highly venomous viper's nest where the incredibly heavy air was constantly suffocating with deeply whispered, lethal conspiracies and highly toxic jealousies, primarily heavily dominated by the immensely powerful Empress Wang and the highly favored consort Xiao. Upon significantly returning from the deeply desolate, incredibly depressing temple, Zetian was extremely acutely aware that she was currently a highly vulnerable, incredibly visible target, entirely surrounded by numerous vicious predators eagerly waiting for the perfect opportunity to brutally tear her completely apart. She immediately and brilliantly adopted a highly convincing facade of incredibly sickeningly sweet, totally unwavering subservience, expertly maneuvering her way deeply into the powerful Empress's good graces while actively and secretly planting deeply toxic, highly destructive seeds of paranoia entirely designed to successfully turn the two absolutely most powerful women in the Empire viciously against each other. Her ongoing psychological warfare was an absolute masterpiece of genuinely lethal, highly intricate manipulation. She completely played the terribly terrified, incredibly fragile victim entirely perfectly, thoroughly blinding them completely to the massive, monstrous apex predator quietly lurking just beneath her painted smile. But her absolute ultimate masterstroke of genuine psychological horror required a blood sacrifice so incredibly unimaginably depraved that it would permanently and thoroughly stain her dark soul in the absolute deepest, most inescapable pitch imaginable. Wu had recently given birth to an incredibly beautiful, highly innocent baby girl, a supposedly fragile, bright symbol of new hope, yet strictly within her heavily calculating, entirely psychopathic mind. The incredibly helpless infant was merely the absolute ultimate weapon of complete mass destruction. One particularly frigid, deeply silent afternoon, the incredibly powerful Empress Wang happily visited the newborn, her usually heavily guarded heart momentarily completely softened by the highly innocent, extremely bright smile of the tiny baby. The exact moment the Empress finally departed the room, Zetian silently entered the deeply isolated, incredibly quiet nursery. Standing highly still directly over the wooden crib, she actively stared down at her incredibly own flesh and blood with deeply terrifying eyes completely entirely emptied of absolutely any recognizable maternal warmth, possessing absolutely only a highly chilling, incredibly clinical calculus. Without a single, tiny tremor of hesitation or even a highly brief, passing flicker of human remorse, she firmly placed her cold hands directly over the helpless infant's incredibly tiny nose and very small mouth. She quietly and relentlessly watched the incredibly agonizing, incredibly desperate physical struggle, actively feeling the highly desperate, incredibly frantic flailing of her absolutely very own child slowly but incredibly surely extinguish permanently under her terrifying, deeply suffocating, and incredibly unyielding physical grip. It was an absolutely horrifying act of incredibly pure, totally unadulterated, entirely primal psychopathy, completely crossing a profoundly terrifying moral threshold from which there was absolutely incredibly no return whatsoever. When Gaozong finally actively arrived, she immediately unleashed a highly theatrical, entirely completely apocalyptic performance of incredibly manufactured grief, her massive, highly artificial wails of deep agony actively tearing violently through the incredibly long, highly echoing palace corridors. She immediately and viciously accused the currently childless, deeply desperate Empress Wang of the incredibly grotesque, highly brutal murder, actively utilizing the incredibly pure innocence of the tiny victim to massively amplify the sheer horror. Gaozong, thoroughly manipulated by Wu's incredibly hysterical, totally overwhelming grief and already incredibly heavily mentally shackled by her highly intoxicating, deeply terrifying psychological dominance, was absolutely blinded by a highly devastating, entirely uncontrollable rage. He simply couldn't incredibly fathom that a human mother could incredibly brutally butcher her very own tiny infant in such cold blood. This massively monstrous, incredibly blood-curdling, highly sociopathic deception was the absolute definitive, massively destructive turning point. It completely and entirely decimated her highly powerful rivals in a single, absolutely incredibly devastating psychological blow. Wu Zetian had entirely completely weaponized her very own incredibly biological womb, firmly proving that her genuinely insatiable, completely endless thirst for total absolute power was an entirely bottomless, utterly terrifying abyss, completely ready to ruthlessly devour even her very own innocent offspring just to aggressively forge a totally unbreakable, incredibly bloody path directly to the highly coveted imperial throne. With the formerly highly powerful Empress Wang and the incredibly arrogant consort Xiao completely stripped of their imperial titles and currently rotting in a deeply damp, suffocating subterranean dungeon, Wu Zetian finally aggressively ascended to the coveted position of Empress. However, her profoundly insatiable, genuinely terrifying appetite for total psychological dominance demanded far more than a simple political victory. It absolutely required a highly public spectacle of incredibly gruesome suffering so deeply unimaginable that it would thoroughly paralyze the vast empire with ingrained, permanent terror. The mere continued physical existence of her defeated rivals, even as broken prisoners, was an unacceptable flaw in her meticulously crafted reality. When a passing moment of pathetic weakness surprisingly prompted Emperor Gaozong to foolishly visit the dark dungeon, openly expressing a fleeting sigh of deep pity for his profoundly broken former wives, Wu Zetian's highly calculating mind instantly crystallized into an absolute state of chilling, demonic retribution. Even the slightest hint of human pity was a direct, dangerous threat to her terrifying supremacy. She instantly dispatched her most terrifyingly ruthless, highly psychopathic executioners directly into the suffocating, dark depths of their isolated cell. What rapidly followed was not merely a simple, quick execution, but an incredibly steep descent directly into an unparalleled, horrifying psychological hell. Under her explicit, highly detailed, chillingly whispered orders, the massive guards mercilessly, highly brutally beat both Wang and Xiao, systematically completely shattering their fragile human bones with extremely heavy, solid wooden clubs until they were screaming in uncontrollable agony. But the true, deep horror had genuinely only just begun. Wu viciously commanded that all of their hands and both of their feet be brutally and permanently amputated entirely, deliberately leaving them as completely limbless, profusely bleeding human torsos entirely discarded on the incredibly cold, filthy stone floor. She completely didn't ever want them quickly dead, she deeply wanted them strictly to profoundly experience a living, inescapable nightmare, actively forcing them to fully feel the utter and absolute annihilation of every single remaining vestige of their very humanity. She then heavily ordered these agonizing, totally brutally mutilated bodies directly to be stuffed violently into massive, completely deep brewing vats entirely filled right to the absolute brim with extremely sharp, highly burning acidic wine. Let these two pathetic, completely wicked witches slowly rot directly straight down to their completely shattered bones within their intoxicating bliss, she intensely declared, a genuinely sick, profoundly sadistic, totally demonic smile actively playing directly on her cold lips. She officially named them human swine, deeply stripping them entirely of their given names, their former dignity, and their absolute very status as living human beings. For many agonizing days, the deeply blood-curdling, completely incredibly desperate shrieks of the completely limbless, dying women loudly echoed incessantly from the deep vats, the highly acidic alcohol severely actively searing their highly raw, totally bleeding amputated stumps in a massive, completely unholy symphony of genuinely unimaginable, deeply psychopathic torment. The massive psychological shockwave of this deeply grotesque, completely unimaginable atrocity rapidly ripped violently through the completely terrified imperial court. It was a highly calculated, entirely theatrical display of absolute omnipotence, a deeply terrifying, highly visible message written heavily in fresh human blood and completely severed limbs, to ever foolishly dare oppose the absolutely supreme Empress Wu was to instantly and actively invite a highly gruesome fate that was infinitely worse than a simple physical death. The many powerful court officials literally completely trembled in deeply suffocating, totally paralyzed silence, their very spines actively turning completely to solid ice, finally profoundly realizing they were absolutely now entirely strictly at the complete and utterly absolute mercy of a deeply terrifying sovereign who undeniably actively possessed the deeply terrifying, totally limitless creativity of a genuinely true, completely unstoppable psychopath. Wu Zetian literally proudly stood directly over the bubbling brewing vats of deep human agony, deeply inhaling the incredibly thick, highly metallic stench of slow death as if it were the most profoundly incredibly sweet, completely intoxicating perfume of absolutely total, highly incredibly untouchable, entirely absolute supreme power. The agonizing groans of the human swine had barely faded into the suffocating silence of the palace walls before Wu Zetian ruthlessly turned her predatory, highly calculating gaze toward the true, deeply entrenched pillars of the Tang Dynasty. The sprawling inner harem was entirely hers, completely subdued, but the outer court, a massive labyrinth of stubborn bureaucracy and deeply arrogant masculine privilege, remained an intolerable obstacle to her absolute supreme power. At its unquestioned apex stood Zhongsun Wuji, the legendary founding statesman, a man whose sheer political gravity effortlessly dwarfed Gaozong's incredibly fragile authority. To Wu Zetian, Zhongsun was not merely a minister, he was the literal psychological manifestation of the entrenched old world order that dared to deny her divine right to openly rule. She absolutely did not attack him with the blunt, messy force of an assassin's blade, but rather with the deeply creeping, entirely invisible rod of highly advanced psychological warfare. Wu Zetian was a brilliant architect of total paranoia, meticulously and patiently constructing a suffocating, incredibly tight web of completely fabricated treason around the aging statesman. She actively utilized Su Jingzong, a highly sycophantic, completely pathetic official whose internal moral compass had been completely obliterated by her deeply intoxicating, heavily manipulative promises of massive, unchecked power. Under her completely chilling, deeply absolute orchestration, dark whispers of a massive phantom rebellion were systematically and heavily planted directly into Gaozong's incredibly rapidly fracturing, profoundly weak mind. She successfully and heavily capitalized upon the fragile emperor's deeply seated, profound insecurities, feeding him a highly continuous, incredibly toxic drip of absolute lies that completely portrayed his most deeply loyal uncle as a highly dangerous, looming usurper aggressively preparing to violently strike. The deep psychological manipulation was terrifyingly incredibly precise. She actively twisted Gaozong's profound, total reliance upon Zhang Sun directly into a deeply suffocating, incredibly terrifying massive paranoia. As the highly incredibly fabricated, utterly fake evidence of massive treason mysteriously and suddenly materialized completely out of thin air, the entire court was completely paralyzed by a deeply collective, profoundly unspoken terror. Absolutely no single person actively dared to defend the highly respected old man, their entire silence completely bought by the absolute sheer, highly unadulterated fear of Wu Zetian's incredibly destructive wrath. Zhang Sun Wuji was brutally stripped of his massive, staggering power and actively exiled to the highly remote, completely unforgiving malarial provinces, his incredibly legendary legacy entirely completely reduced absolutely to mere ashes by the deeply venomous breath of a single, monstrous woman. But deeply incredibly, mere exile was absolutely never enough for Wu Zetian. Basic survival simply left open room for future revenge. She quickly and ruthlessly dispatched a heavily armed envoy actively carrying an imperial decree completely forcing the completely broken old statesman to actively hang himself in incredibly dark isolation, successfully completely cementing his absolute total destruction. Alongside him, Chu Suiliang and multiple other highly formidable, incredibly stubborn opponents were systematically completely purged without mercy, their entire extended families brutally slaughtered in cold blood or permanently banished to incredibly deep malarial swamps. The massive purge was an absolute psychological masterclass in total, absolute terror, an incredibly bloody, highly theatrical show entirely designed specifically to completely eradicate the very basic concept of political defiance. The deeply terrified court was entirely completely transformed directly into a highly macabre, totally terrifying puppet show, where every single surviving minister absolutely danced helplessly on invisible strings completely and entirely actively manipulated by a profoundly merciless, highly psychopathic empress who had completely definitively proven she could easily obliterate the mightiest titans of human history with absolutely nothing more than a carefully whispered, completely fabricated lie. As Emperor Gaozong's highly fragile health catastrophically deteriorated, leaving him brutally crippled by agonizingly blinding headaches and a deeply debilitating, terrifying loss of vision, an incredibly sinister, completely unstoppable transformation slowly enveloped the massive dragon throne. The deeply suffering emperor's active physical decay was an absolutely meticulously guarded, highly incredibly deep secret, but for the highly calculating Wu Zetian, his deeply agonizing, incredibly terrifying illness was absolutely the ultimate, deeply highly coveted gift, a completely golden opportunity to successfully completely fully usurp the entire massive empire without ever publicly unsheathing a single bloody blade. She incredibly brilliantly and highly systematically became his completely indispensable, absolute primary crutch, deeply isolating him incredibly successfully within a deeply suffocating, highly inescapable cocoon of total physical and psychological dependency while highly incredibly methodically positioning herself completely directly behind a literal and deeply highly metaphorical ornate pearl screen directly in the massive, highly incredibly echoing main audience hall. From this highly deeply shadowy, completely invisible vantage point, she incredibly entirely actively fully became the unseen, highly terrifying puppeteer of the entire sprawling empire, a disembodied voice continually dripping with deeply absolute, profoundly terrifying authority. Her totally complete psychological subjugation of the rapidly fading Gaozong was genuinely entirely complete and deeply total. She incredibly actively controlled absolutely his highly specific daily diet, his vital medications, and the highly specific flow of every single piece of critical information that ever actually reached his highly desperate ears. She was the completely entirely only incredibly highly specific active filter through which he experienced the entire outside world, thoroughly twisting his fragile perception of actual reality specifically to directly align entirely perfectly with her absolutely deeply entirely monstrous, totally limitless incredibly dark ambitions. The highly terrified, trembling powerful minister standing in the massive grand hall actively deeply entirely trembled intensely before an incredibly completely entirely empty imperial throne, completely taking their absolute commands directly from the terrifying, ethereal silhouette hiding deeply behind the highly entirely incredibly absolute pearls. She instituted an incredibly terrifying reign of absolute psychological warfare, demanding obsequious, daily loyalty reports and actively encouraging a highly toxic, deeply destructive culture of absolutely anonymous, totally malicious informants. The thick air in the massive imperial capital quickly grew incredibly heavy with a deeply completely suffocating, entirely inescapable paranoia. Loyal brothers completely brutally betrayed their own innocent brothers, and young sons violently absolutely deeply turned against their loving fathers, all desperately highly scrambling simply to appease the incredibly invisible monster violently hiding absolutely perfectly behind the screen. Zetian systematically purged any official who dared to question her creeping absolutism, executing them with chilling bureaucratic efficiency. When Gaozong, in a rare, fleeting moment of lucidity, attempted to draft an edict with Chancellor Shangguan Yi to depose her, her spies intercepted the plot before the ink could even dry. She confronted the frail emperor with the terrifying fury of a demonic entity. Gaozong, utterly crushed by her overwhelming psychological dominance and paralyzed by fear, instantly betrayed Shangguan Yi, cowardly blaming the chancellor for the entire scheme. Shangguan and his family were brutally slaughtered, their blood painting the palace floors. From that moment on, the illusion of Gaozong's rule evaporated completely. Zetian was no longer just a consort or an empress, she was the suffocating, all-consuming shadow that devoured the Tang dynasty from the inside out, establishing a breathtakingly cruel autarky built entirely upon the shattered sanity of a rapidly dying, utterly broken man. To firmly construct an incredibly vast empire of absolute, unimpeachable terror, one must be absolutely entirely willing to happily sacrifice absolutely everything, and Zetian rapidly proved her deeply horrifying, incredibly psychopathic resolve by actively turning her highly predatory instincts directly toward her very own innocent flesh and blood. The royal crown princes, her incredibly very own biological sons, were absolutely not seen as her future heirs, they were profoundly viewed as massive psychological threats, deeply independent, highly intelligent minds that possessed the deeply legitimate, completely undeniable claim to a massive dragon throne she had completely relentlessly and brutally clawed her way to absolute control. Her highly targeted first victim was her deeply respected eldest son, Li Hong, a young, brilliant man universally beloved for his deeply profound human compassion and totally unwavering, deeply pure morality. His blatant, highly public defiance of her deeply tyrannical, completely psychopathic policies and his sickening, deeply pathetic empathy for her heavily defeated, broken rivals rapidly ignited a highly monstrous, completely lethal, intensely burning hatred deep within his own mother's cold heart. During a highly extravagant, incredibly massive royal banquet hosted in the gilded Jiuqing Palace, the young Li Hong suddenly and violently collapsed to the floor, aggressively coughing up vast quantities of completely black, highly toxic blood, his absolutely agonizing, deeply terrifying death spasms loudly echoing intensely through the deeply terrified, totally silent gilded halls. While the deeply trembling court officially only quietly whispered of a sudden, tragic illness, the completely suffocating, deeply terrified atmosphere actively screamed of potent poison, a deeply monstrous mother entirely meticulously assassinating her very own firstborn son simply because his pure virtue was an absolute, deeply intolerable obstacle to her completely supreme, absolutely undeniable evil. But the insatiable, completely dark bloodlust of the highly terrifying Empress absolutely did not end there. The highly talented second son, Zetian, an incredibly brilliantly intelligent and incredibly perceptive royal scholar, actively posed an incredibly even graver, far more dangerous psychological danger. He actively possessed the highly dangerous, completely intolerable ability to completely see directly right through her highly complex Machiavellian facade, openly expressing his deeply suffocating, totally paralyzing dread in a highly hauntingly symbolic, completely desperate poem about a helpless melon vine being completely and totally brutally stripped entirely of all its fruit by a highly ravenous, entirely unstoppable harvester. Zetian instantly recognized his profound, deeply accurate psychological insight as a highly fatal, deeply dangerous disease that absolutely had to be totally eradicated without any mercy. She immediately launched a completely devastating, highly orchestrated, massively destructive campaign of total psychological destruction against him, entirely flooding his massive royal palace with countless invisible spies and violently, completely falsely framing him for entirely massive, deeply coordinated treason and violent assassination. She actively weaponized his very own brilliant intelligence, deeply twisting it into a completely fabricated, highly toxic narrative of incredibly paranoid rebellion. Hundreds of deadly weapons were magically discovered entirely in his stables. Brutally stripped entirely of all his royal titles, Zetian was deeply humiliated and aggressively exiled completely into the highly desolate, completely barren wilderness. But even forced exile was a highly unacceptable, deeply lingering vulnerability that Zetian absolutely could not ever tolerate. She quickly dispatched her absolute most highly ruthless, entirely psychopathic inquisitor, Zhou Shinji, directly to Zetian's incredibly remote, deeply cold prison. The highly terrified prince was violently cornered and physically forced to immediately hang himself in a completely dark, entirely isolated, incredibly suffocating room, actively suffocating while deeply possessing the horrifying knowledge that his absolutely very own mother was the sole, completely unrepentant architect of his incredibly brutal demise. The incredibly vast empire watched in a completely deeply paralyzed, entirely mute, absolutely profound horror. By viciously devouring her very own helpless young in such an incredibly grotesque, highly deeply calculated manner, Zetian crossed a deeply terrifying, absolutely uncrossable psychological Rubicon, sending a deeply blood-chilling, completely undeniable message to absolutely every single living soul: if she could easily slaughter her very own children without a single, tiny flicker of maternal remorse, absolutely no one in the entire sprawling empire was remotely safe from her deeply monstrous, absolutely all-consuming ambition. To sustain an empire built on a foundation of usurped power and murdered kin, Zetian unleashed a psychological plague of absolute terror, instituting a sprawling secret police force that plunged the entire nation into a suffocating, blood-soaked nightmare. At the helm of this sadistic machinery were monsters cloaked in human skin, men like Li Junchen and Zhou Xing, psychopathic architects of agony who elevated torture into a grotesque, highly complex art form. They authored the infamous Manual of Accusation, a terrifying bureaucratic blueprint designed specifically to manufacture guilt, ensuring that absolutely anyone, regardless of actual innocence, could be systematically shattered into a trembling, desperately confessing wreck. The empire became a claustrophobic prison of paranoia. Massive copper boxes were strategically installed across the capital, insatiable gaping maws actively inviting anonymous betrayals from commoners and nobles alike. A single whispered rumor, a fabricated grievance dropped into the box, was more than enough to violently drag entire aristocratic families into the lightless, blood-stained dungeons of the secret police. Inside those subterranean hellscapes, deep psychological devastation was heavily prioritized over mere physical destruction. Li Junchen utilized a horrifying array of nightmarish devices, rusting iron cages that forced victims to stand on agonizingly sharp spikes for days, extremely heavy wooden collars that slowly, incredibly painfully crushed human collarbones, and the legendary, terrifying copper urn. The urn was a colossal bronze vessel of immense proportions. Naked victims were violently forced inside while a roaring, intense fire was slowly ignited directly beneath it. As the heavy metal slowly heated, the excruciating psychological anticipation of being literally boiled alive drove the helpless victims into states of catastrophic, entirely irreversible madness. They would eagerly and desperately confess to the most absurd, mathematically impossible treasons, desperately begging the smirking guards for the simple mercy of a swift, clean decapitation just to quickly escape the unbearable, simmering agony. Zetian calmly watched this symphony of torment from her pristine, deeply isolated palaces, actively utilizing these psychopathic butchers as her heavily leashed rabid attack dogs to completely and permanently eradicate any lingering vestiges of stubborn Tang loyalism. She intentionally engineered a deeply broken society where survival depended entirely on turning a blind, cowardly eye to absolutely unspeakable atrocities, effectively weaponizing the terror of her own subjects directly against themselves. The very soul of the massive empire was brutally mutilated, basic human trust was entirely annihilated, thoroughly replaced by a cold, trembling, and absolute obedience born from the absolute darkest depths of human fear. The agonizing screams echoing from the secret dungeons formed a gruesome, invisible throne upon which Zetian comfortably sat, undisputed, entirely omnipotent, and utterly terrifying, ruling a fractured world completely broken by her meticulously orchestrated madness. The deep, continuously flowing rivers of blood had meticulously paved the way, and the agonizing screams of her countless victims provided the dark, swelling symphony for Zetian's ultimate, deeply unholy ascension to absolute supremacy. In a breathtaking display of psychological audacity that shocked the continent, she did not merely usurp the throne of the Tang Dynasty, she completely annihilated its very metaphysical existence. She brutally cast aside the Li family's ancestral mandate and brazenly declared herself the holy and divine emperor of her entirely new, absolutely unprecedented dynasty, the Great Zhou. To actively enforce this staggering, reality-altering paradigm shift, she fundamentally rewired the cultural and linguistic fabric of the entire empire. She aggressively invented a completely new set of complex Chinese characters, physically forcing her millions of subjects to write, communicate, and think using symbols that were born entirely from her boundless, deeply autocratic ego. One deeply significant character, Zhao, designed specifically for her own new imperial name, depicted the bright sun and the glowing moon hovering highly above the earth, a chillingly overt, undeniable declaration that she was the absolute cosmic epicenter of the universe, a literal living deity reigning over a totally submissive world. The deep psychological manipulation was extremely grand and highly theatrical. She actively orchestrated massive, entirely fabricated public discoveries of prophetic white stones in the Luo River, massive stones that supposedly bore ancient divine inscriptions unequivocally confirming her absolute, undeniable right to rule the heavens and earth. She masterfully weaponized religion, actively funding and aggressively promoting a heavily doctored Buddhist sutra that conveniently prophesied the apocalyptic return of Maitreya Buddha, specifically in the highly unexpected form of a powerful female monarch. By artificially elevating herself to the absolute status of a living god, she brilliantly transformed simple political rebellion into a terrifying act of profound religious heresy, severely punishing any dissent not just with gruesome physical death, but with the deeply terrifying, psychologically paralyzing promise of eternal spiritual damnation. Her coronation was an incredibly opulent, heavily suffocating spectacle of total, unquestioning submission. Hundreds of thousands of subjects, heavily indoctrinated by years of systemic terror and highly advanced state-sponsored propaganda, forcefully prostrated themselves before her imposing, terrifying figure, loudly chanting her newly invented divine titles in a hypnotic, deeply terrifying cult-like frenzy. She slowly surveyed the massive, completely trembling ocean of humanity from atop the elevated dragon throne, her dark eyes cold, deeply calculating, and absolutely completely devoid of any recognizable human empathy. She had successfully and totally conquered not only the immense physical vastness of the sprawling empire but the very psychological architecture of millions of living minds. She was absolutely no longer just an ambitious empress, she was the omnipotent architect of reality itself, a monstrous deity who had completely rewritten history, language, and truth, actively forcing the entire world to breathe exclusively at the merciless, rhythmic pulse of her absolute iron will. The monstrous, towering zenith of her terrifying absolute power was embodied perfectly in the construction of the Ming Tang, a massive, towering, deeply megalomaniacal structure of staggering, mind-boggling proportions that aggressively pierced the heavens, serving as a terrifying architectural manifestation of her entirely suffocating, boundless ego. Inside its highly gilded, deeply oppressive, and heavily guarded walls, Zetian, now rapidly becoming an aging, deeply grotesque caricature of a former deity, slowly descended into a deeply disturbing era of horrifying, unrestrained decadence and profound psychological detachment from reality. Completely surrounded by the infamous Zhang brothers, her notoriously flamboyant, incredibly vain, and viciously manipulative male concubines, she actively transformed the once dignified imperial court into a highly macabre, totally nauseating theater of hypersexualized, absolute tyranny. The deeply ambitious brothers, heavily empowered by the elderly, failing Empress's insatiable physical lust and actively decaying mental faculties, rapidly wielded an immense, absolutely terrifying level of deeply unchecked influence, brutally slaughtering high-ranking, deeply respected officials and royal imperial princes who even foolishly dared to simply glance at them with the slightest hint of disrespect. The once terrifyingly sharp, highly calculated intellect of Wu Zetian was actively, visibly dissolving into a highly chaotic, deeply volatile, and entirely pathetic stew of intense paranoia and obsessive, animalistic physical gratification. Yet, even deeply mired in her highly putrid, embarrassing physical decline, the deeply ingrained aura of total terror she had meticulously cultivated for over half a century remained fiercely, deeply paralyzingly potent across the empire. The remaining court officials were hopelessly trapped in a profoundly nauseating psychological paradox, completely, utterly terrified of the highly capricious, deeply murderous whims of the violently arrogant Zhang brothers, yet simultaneously utterly paralyzed by the deeply ingrained, absolute bone-deep fear of the monstrous, aging woman who was still quietly pulling all of their strings from her dark bedchamber. It ultimately took a highly desperate, terrifyingly orchestrated, completely blood-soaked military coup, the infamous Shenlong Revolution, to finally violently break the deeply entrenched, suffocating spell. Heavily armed generals, completely suffocating under countless decades of deeply silent, highly agonizing terror, violently and suddenly breached her heavily guarded inner sanctum, instantly and brutally decapitating the deeply arrogant Zhang brothers and aggressively, brutally tossing their completely severed, profusely bleeding heads directly at the fragile feet of the deeply shocked, 80-year-old Empress. As she lay completely and utterly bedridden, completely physically broken but with her dark eyes still fiercely burning with an entirely unholy, deeply defiant, and totally unrepentant hellfire, she was violently, forcibly coerced into finally abdicating the dragon throne, actively and finally returning the deeply scarred empire back to the Li family. But even entirely in her final, deeply agonizing moments, completely isolated in a cold, entirely echoing palace completely devoid of her former terrifying glory, she experienced absolutely no horrifying epiphany, absolutely no tearful, genuine repentance. She died exactly, perfectly as she lived, an absolutely merciless, deeply calculating apex predator, an entirely unrepentant, incredibly brilliant architect of massive, continent-spanning mass suffering who had violently bent an entire sophisticated civilization completely and entirely to her monstrous, unstoppable will. Her ultimate historical legacy was absolutely not merely a brief dynasty, but rather a deeply profound, completely unhealable psychological scar violently slashed directly across the very living soul of all Chinese history, an eternal, incredibly chilling, deeply haunting testament to the terrifying, completely limitless depths of absolute human depravity that constantly emerge when absolute, completely unchecked power is successfully harnessed.